citation reads as follows. Cardinal Francis George, OMI, Doctor of Theology, honoris causa. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous works among all of the peoples. Thus the psalmist declares that joyful witness to the ways God has intervened in all of human history is an essential part of the mission given to all believers. The mission of witnessing effectively to God's love in Christ in dialogue with different cultures has been one of the key elements of the life and ministry of Francis Cardinal George. As a young missionary oblate of Mary Immaculate, serving the people of Mississippi during the height of the Civil Rights Movement, he learned of the obstacles often placed in the way of witnessing to this good news. Later, as Vicar General of the OMIs, through his extensive travels throughout the world visiting members of his community, he gained extensive practical knowledge about the relationship between the gospel and culture. Working with his confrere, noted missiologist Marcelo Hugo, OMI, who later became Secretary of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, Francis George reflected long and hard on the best and most appropriate ways of interculturating the faith. This interest led to study at the Pontifical Urbania University and his doctoral dissertation, Inculturation and Ecclesial Communion, Culture and Church in the Teaching of John Paul II. As Archbishop of Chicago, many of his writings have dealt with missiological themes. His pastoral letter on racism, Dwell in My Love, is widely regarded as a model of Episcopal teaching on this difficult topic still at issue in American Catholic life. His two books, The Difference That God Makes, A Catholic Vision of Faith, Communion and Culture, and God in Action, How Faith in God Can Address the Challenges of the World, directly take up the challenge of witnessing to the gospel in both United States culture and secularized societies in general. His pastoral concern as Archbishop for ongoing relationships of respect and engagement with the Jewish community, as well as his early and continuing outreach to the Muslim community, have made Chicago a central place for interreligious dialogue in the United States. CTU is especially grateful for his consistent support of its commitment to carrying out the mission of the Church and its preparation of missionaries for work both in the United States and internationally. His commitment to the Augustus Tolkien Scholarship Program for African American ministers and the Oscar Romero Scholarship Program for Hispanic ministers has made it possible for CTU to partner with the Archdiocese in preparing men and women to serve the needs of the Church in Chicago. For these reasons, the faculty and Board of Trustees of Catholic Theological Union are pleased to confer upon Francis Cardinal George, OMI, the degree of Doctor of Theology, honoris causa, given at Chicago on the 11th day of April, 2014, signed Reverend Mark R. Francis, CSV, President.
Well, thank you all for being here, and especially thanks to the trustees and the faculty, the president of CTU, for arranging this convocation and symposium, and for granting me an honorary degree. I'm truly honored and very grateful to you, particularly because you have attached it to the study of mission, and because Bob Schreider, whom I admire very greatly and whom I've spoken to at particularly important moments in my own journey, gave his marvelous analysis of the relationship between mercy and truth, and the pitfalls we fall into should we emphasize only mercy or only truth, forgetting the dialogue between them. I joined a missionary congregation without, at the beginning at least, of a very good sense of what it was all about. Primarily, I wanted to be a priest, and I enjoyed very much the company of the oblates who taught me in high school and admired their community life. And it was only in the novitiate that I began to think, well, what is this really all about? And that they opened up horizons, to use Father Schreider's word, of understanding of what the church really is about, and led me into a way of life that is pure gift, because it's certainly not something that I had planned or even thought of. Perhaps the first time I came to terms with the mission of the church in countries other than this was when I was an elected member of the General Chapter of the Oblates in 1972, which was a transitional chapter, a very contentious chapter in some ways. After the council, of course, every order was told to redo its constitutions in the light of the council, and that pretty much split open the rather tenuous relationships that had been in place between different parts of an international congregation and among many different oblates with very different ideas. And one of the statements that stayed with me from that general chapter is one that stays with me still. It was made by a man named Tisa Balasuriya, who was a liberation theologian from Sri Lanka and whose last years were marked with a lot of conflict and some unhappiness. But Tisa in 1972 was at his peak, and he was very clear. One of the statements he made was that the greatest poverty, because we were speaking about what it means to be a missionary to the poor, and the emphasis was on the poor rather than on the mission. And he, in order to bring some corrective to that, said, the greatest poverty is not to know Jesus Christ. And coming from Tisa, that had an enormous impact on all of us, it becomes very clear in what we've just heard that the reason for that is because only in the encounter with Jesus Christ do we find the infinite love of God with skin on. Do we find the richness that is truly ours, no matter what our physical poverty might be. And in the course then of my own travels, as was mentioned, when I was elected Vicar General of the Oblates in 1974, in the course of that, I experienced Christ most clearly in living with the poor, because for 12 years I traveled much of every year. I never lived in a hotel, never ate in a restaurant. I ate with the people whom the missionaries are very close to. For oblates don't run big institutions. They're very close to the ground, and that has been both something that saved us and also something that gets in the way at times if it shrinks a horizon. But in there I was able to see how poor people live in countries that are riven by civil war, particularly in parts of Africa and Asia and Mindanao and southern Philippines, and also in communist lands, and in secularizing cultures, Australia and ourselves, among the Eskimos and the Inuit of northern Canada and Greenland. I think one of the most impressive masses I ever had was in Nuuk, Gotthard, the capital of Greenland, where the few that were gathered against a background of rocks and glaciers, because there is no soil, gave me the idea of truly what it means to preach the gospel and to celebrate the Eucharist to the ends of the earth. For the ends of the earth aren't the ends of the earth if the Eucharist is celebrated there. Wherever the Eucharist is celebrated, that is the center of the cosmos. But I got to see poor people in many, many different areas on all the continents, and yet what was consistent in the communities that I visited, of course, sometimes there were very few Christians, sometimes they were the majority, but always there was the faith. And without being able to express it always in formula, nonetheless, there was the popular religiosity, and there was the deep sense of Christ's action in their lives through the power of the Spirit. And I became very aware of the unity of the church in that fashion, and that there are many ways to express the faith, many ways that are truly faithful, but are matched to the culture of the people. Sometimes it has to be corrected. There's an evangelization of culture as well as an enculturation of the faith, as we all know. But the depth of the faith, particularly among poor people, made a lasting impression on me. And for that, too, I'm happy to come to CTU always, because here you're preparing missionaries to take up that charge, no matter where they live, particularly among the poor. One of the administrative challenges that accompanied my visits to poor people around the world who were cared for by other oblates was also the changing of responsibility for mission. Vatican II changed the relationship between the church and the world. The church had become too fusty, too much like a museum, too defensive. We simply had to, if we were going to be faithful to the mission, engage the world in dialogue, and Paul VI showed us how to do that in a magnificent way, and it was begun with the spirit of John the 23rd and continued after, particularly in the pastoral visits of John Paul II, where he constantly didn't talk about church-state, he talked about faith culture, because that's the perspective in which the relationship with the world is worked out now, no longer in a juridical framework of church and state with their conflicting claims to sovereignty, but rather through faith and culture. And the missionaries here, future missionaries, are well prepared for that. But that meant also that the ecclesiology, the church's self-understanding, was changing. And it used to be, as many of you know, that missionary orders received a mandatum, and you simply took over huge tracts of land. The oblates took over the far north of Canada and other places as well, parts of Pilcomayo, in Paraguay, in other places, Sri Lanka. But parts of South Africa, especially Lesotho and the kingdoms up there. Anyway, that changed because what the ecclesiology of Vatican II was telling us was it's no longer a question of propaganda fide, giving territories to foreigners to go in and organize the church. The bishop comes from that order, all the clergy come from that order, and you simply start a church kind of on your own terms. That smacks of colonialism, and therefore, even while it was well-intentioned, because we're sharing the greatest gifts of all, that of faith, nonetheless, the structures had to be changed, and in fact, in Vatican's II's Lumen Gentium, where the primary model for church is local church, a communion of local churches with and under the successor of Peter, the mission becomes local church to local church. And so I had to do a lot of work with oblates telling them, look, you've got to give room not only for your people, which they were glad to do, but also for priests from them, and you've got to give up responsibility for this. We're going to look at the Oblate Generalate for bishops who are not oblates in order to take over. And in northern Cameroon, I remember that was particularly difficult because it's a difficult mission, but we now have all non-oblate bishops in the 6 dioceses in the northern Cameroon, the ones between Chad and Nigeria. It was particularly hard there because the French are very smart and they have their own ideas. It's very hard for an American to convince them that they're wrong. But we did. Anyway, it was a constant struggle to say, look, it's changed, troops. It's now local church to local church. Your job here is to create a local church that is able to minister to itself, support itself in the context of poverty very often, with its own cultural particularity, which was already encouraged in many ways, but nonetheless had to be more thematized and encouraged in a more particular way. And that is what has happened, in fact, as we know. The role of propaganda fide is no longer that of grantor of mandates, but rather a kind of a referee to see to it that the churches that are struggling get the help they need from churches that are better established. But everyone gives, everyone receives in the ecclesiology of Vatican II. There are no rich and poor in that sense. Everyone has something to give, and everyone has something to receive. And it was hard for me, first of all, to come to terms with that, and then to try to help my own religious congregation to see what the church was moving towards and how it was being transformed, and the transformation of mission that was involved in that. Mission, of course, remains mission. It is a question of making evident the presence of God to the world and putting names on the various graces that are already there, and then bringing the new graces that the sacraments bring. They don't just name what is going on, they bring the action of Christ himself in sacramental signs to a place where it was no longer or was never present. So it's a question of being faithful to the Lord, being sent by the Lord through the ministry and mission of the church, and doing what all the prophets have done, what Jesus said he was doing in Luke 4 when he quoted Isaiah 61, you sent me to preach the gospel to the poor have the gospel preached to them. That builds up the first proclamation, the kerygma, and then from there the diaconia, the service to one another, both spiritual and material, the works of mercy, which are both spiritual and temporal, and then the koinonia, the communion, the fellowship. That is mission, and it is local, and at the same time, it's to all the nations. It is, and it has to remain universal, as you all know. And so a missionary's life is always kind of in between in many ways. I saw that again and again. We talk about reverse mission, and that's very important for the churches to which missionaries return. But it's also one of the most difficult things for a missionary to come back to a place that he's left. He's changed by his experiences with another people. His own people have evolved. They're not the same people he left. And while it was hard for him to adjust to another people when as a young missionary he went off, it's all the harder when he has to return. If he has to, sometimes they don't. They die where they worked. But if he has to return, and no one is interested, no one can understand, no one cares. And so I'm very grateful for what CTU has done to try to help us understand reverse mission and to expand the horizons of people in local churches so that they do encompass a total mission, a universal mission, all the nations. The magisterium of Pope Francis is an expansion of horizons in a peculiar way that, frankly, I don't quite understand yet, because he has an eschatological hermeneutic that both in public and in private, he has said, shapes what he thinks is the horizon of the mission for our day. To some extent, it means that we can't be dependent upon the powers that be at all. John Paul II saw that. John Paul II, with the fall of communism, was, of course, grateful for that grace. But one thing he said at that time was, now we are alone. Before that, we had the help of the Western nations. Now it is the Western nations themselves that will be an obstacle to mission. Now we are alone. And the present Pope made reference, as some of you might know, to a book written in 1907, The Lord of the World, by the English author Robert Hugh Benson, who was a son of the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, became a Catholic, and then became a Catholic priest. And he was an excellent author. He wrote a number of books, Come Rack, Come Rope, on the Elizabethan martyrs, the Jesuit martyrs under Elizabeth I. And he wrote a book on the end of the world, Lord of the World. The Antichrist turns out to be an obscure senator from Vermont. Of course, he was an Englishman, and so the last pope turns out to be English. But at any rate, it's a fabulously interesting book because he wrote it before there was air travel, before there were all the kinds of things that define the modern world, and he had them all in the book. But most of all, it shows the great apostasy, the shrinking of the church to a very small group of people gathered around the last pope in the Holy Land, and the end of the world when the Antichrist reveals himself and then God intervenes. In a very, very quiet way, he does. He ends the book with the Pope giving the benediction of the Blessed Sacrament to the Tantum Ergo. Then everything is revealed, and there's a new heaven and a new earth. But you wonder, to me anyway, I wonder how it is that if that is formative of his horizon now, and we are all formed by horizons, whether it's the horizon of our becoming ordained a priest, or passing the next test, or preparing for the next lectures, or our own death, or whatever, our horizons keep shifting. And if that is his horizon, then it fits very well with mercy as a theme, but he's never explicitated the relationship between mercy and the end of the world. In a sense, John Paul II, in creating Divine Mercy Sunday, was reliant upon the revelations of Sister Faustina, and those are eschatological in some ways. That it's very important that the church at the end time be a voice for mercy, God's infinite mercy. Conversion is possible, forgiveness is always there. Accept it, you're not alone. And yet, while he has said that that is the horizon, he's never connected it in that way. And so I'm waiting to see what happens next in a certain sense. In some sense, of course, what Father Thomas said about liturgy is eschatological. It has to be. Liturgy is the seeds of eternal life that we take into our own bodies, according to John 6, and that are the assurance that we will live forever. So therefore, there's always an eschatological dimension to liturgy as well, something that perhaps in the liturgical renewal we also haven't paid very much attention to. But the whole question of eschatology and its relationship to mercy is one that I'm still waiting for the Holy Father to elaborate, and he will in his own way, in his own time. He's a very wise man, and he knows what he's doing. He does it in bits and pieces, and so some people are a little bit taken off guard, but nonetheless, I think he knows very well what he's doing, and we have to trust that this is the Pope the Lord wants us to have, thank God, and that what he is doing is going to shape our horizon for our ministry as we go forward. One of the challenges to being a local bishop, particularly in a very developed church like the Archdiocese of Chicago, one that is in very ways self-sufficient and has done important things in the history of the church, is that there's a tension sometimes between ministry and mission. That is, even in the seminaries, we can train people to be ministers, but that means for a profession, for a career perhaps. And we lose track of the fact that it is the mission that is the purpose of all our ministries. It's the mission that gives life, not ministry as such. And in a large church, in a small church too, there can be a tension between ministry and mission. And one of the things I have tried to do is to keep talking about mission all the time and to place ministry in relationship to that. It's one of the reasons why at times I'm impatient with a certain provincialism, for even truly great places, Chicago in its own way is great, can be quite provincial in other ways. And so we all have to be aware of the fact that as part of a universal church, certainly, our horizons expand beyond any particular church or beyond any particular task that we have in front of us at any time. That the church is someone that brings all people, all nations in, and they are our brothers and sisters, and not foreigners and strangers, let alone enemies. CTU is an important part of that. CTU has reached out in conversation in a very formal way with the Jewish community, with the Muslim community. It's a place where ministry cannot take the place of mission. Where mission is primary, it is the most important place in this country for missiological studies because of the faculty that was gathered here, because the SVDs were involved in the very foundation, and they have always been not only great missionaries, but also people who have taken time to study mission and created the science of missiology, really. So in that sense also, if you have to be bishop of a local church, this is a good one to be archbishop of. So I'm very thankful to all of you, to the grace of God, for the gift that my own ministry has been here, and for your understanding, even when I have been infuriating. I thank you very, very much.